Okay, the House Appropriations Subcommittee on General Government will come to order. Clerk, please take the roll call.
Chairman Kuhn.
Here.
Representatives Van Workum.
Here.
Kelly.
Here.
Maddock.
Here.
Snyder.
Here.
All members present.
Okay, the House Appropriations Subcommittee on General Government will follow the Uniform Committee rules stated in Chapter 4 of the House Rules that were adopted on the House floor, and any applicable rules adopted by the Appropriations Committee. Today, we all have these booklets here that have pretty extensive documentation. I think it's pretty much everything that the subcommittee members will need. Michael Knassen from Fiscal will give a preview of all the, a budget review of all the 8 departments. Because of the length of that, I would typically say have questions throughout, but hopefully we'll be able to hold the questions till the end, and if we don't get to them, please forward them. Next week, we are going to go intensely into boilerplate and boilerplate reports, including past boilerplate from several sessions ago. And please, each of our members, think of boilerplate that you think is important to hold our departments accountable, because the boilerplate will be a high priority for us this session. Okay, Michael Knassen is our Senior Fiscal Analyst of House Fiscal Agency, and he's going to provide an overview of the current year budgets for general government with comparisons to the fiscal year exec recs. Mr. Knassen.
Good morning, subcommittee representatives. As the chair mentioned, I am Michael Knassen, and I am the fiscal analyst that oversees the general government budget. Today's presentation will aim to give a general overview of all the budgets and the mechanics and how they're funded and the major key components of each of them. As Representative Kuhn mentioned, you have binders in front of you that contain several documents. The first is the governor's recommended, a summary, the House Fiscal Agency summary of the governor's recommended budget for fiscal year 26. There are organizational charts of each of the departments. You have this presentation that I'm presenting today. There is a conference summary of the fiscal year 25 budget that shows all the decisions that were made throughout the budget process last year for fiscal year 25. And those decisions, there are no changes between the conference and the enacted. There are a list of work projects approved in 2024. This is similar to a report that was sent out in October and September. However, they've been updated. The balances have been updated for January. There is a report from our agency, a report on reports that are required by boilerplate. And lastly, we have Article 5 of PA 121 of 2024, which is the general government budget, enacted budget. So there are quite a few slides that we'll be going through, so I'll try to move quickly, touching on the main points of each of them to save time for questions at the end. If you do have any questions, I am always available to reach out to, either about the presentation or any budget or appropriations matters. So, starting off, the general government budget is many budgets. It includes multiple executive departments, including the Attorney General, led by an elected official, the Attorney General, Civil Rights. It includes the Executive Office and Legislature, Department of State, Department of Technology Management and Budget, and Treasury. Within some of these executive departments, you also have Type 1 agencies that are autonomous, and they have independent budgets. They are appropriated under the department budgets, but their budgets are their own. So for the general government budget, it's $5.2 billion gross. And over half of that is in restricted funds. And nearly all of these restricted funds, well, about 1.8 billion of the restricted funds goes to revenue sharing. So it's a pass-through through Treasury to locals. About a quarter of it comes in IDGs. Of these IDGs, about 1 billion of them go to DTMB for IT services. They are the centralized IT service provider. And then approximately another quarter is general fund. So compared to the rest of the state budget, general government is the fourth largest at about 5%. This is adjusted gross, so this does not include the IDGs that I mentioned, since those kind of are a double counting. Those are initially appropriated in other departments and agencies and then transferred to DTMB as an IDG. So not counting IDGs, general government is 5% of the state budget and just almost $4 billion. As far as the general fund share of the total state budget, it's 8%. This is partly due to SBA rent, State Building Authority rent, and debt service. These are dollars owed to pay off debt obligations of the state and bonds, and together they total just under $400 million general fund. So for each budget, we'll take a look back at the funding history for general government in total. You see a couple things stand out. One is a huge spike in federal funding in 2020. This is related to appropriations for the Unemployment Insurance Authority to cover the spike in uninsurance claims that year. Another thing that stands out is fiscal year 23, a jump up in general fund. And this is related to really many one-time appropriations, notably local pension grants, mid-year deposits into the SOAR fund, and other one-time economic development or other grants. And to the right, I include the executive recommended budget. And in general government as a whole, and as you'll see in many of the departments, there is generally a marginal increase from the current fiscal year. The fiscal year 26 recommendation has generally included less than we've seen in prior years, so there's fewer items. But there are still some major items to look at, but overall, you'll see marginal increases from the current year. So this is a look at where the money in general government is distributed. As mentioned earlier, revenue sharing is actually the largest slice of the pie with nearly $1.8 billion. Next is the operations for the Department of Technology Management and Budget at $1.6 billion, and then operations for Treasury. And then you see the rest of the departments kind of tail off there. Looking at where the general fund is within general government, as mentioned, much of it is in SBA rent and debt service, that $341 million general fund. The second largest is about a quarter of it goes to DTMB for their operations, and then Treasury, 18% goes to Treasury. And then legislature is fourth largest at 17%. Included a slide on the Budget Stabilization Fund, which is appropriated under general government. This is also the rainy day fund. For fiscal year 26, the governor has recommended another $50 million deposit, similar to what was recommended for the current year. If that was included, that would bring the balance is currently at about $2.3 billion. With the interest and with the deposit from the tobacco settlement, that would bring the fiscal year 26 balance up to about $2.5 billion. So overall, the changes between the current year and the governor's budget would be a $53 million increase gross, $95 million increase general fund. I will note that there was a mid-year transfer of restricted dollars into DTMB. This is a bit of a technical adjustment. It's related to the Make It in Michigan Competitiveness Fund. I won't get into the details, but it's a technical, it's a kind of a reappropriation of previously appropriated dollars. So for that reason, it kind of brings up the current year's numbers without actually appropriating new dollars. So with that taken out, the fiscal year 26 governor's budget is actually an increase of $219.3 million gross. And you see that in the restricted funds there. So I just want to make note of that, since it kind of somewhat inflates the current year amount. But taking that out, you see a $219 million increase from last year, or the current year, sorry. So moving on to the first executive department is the Attorney General. The Attorney General's powers are prescribed by the state constitution and delineated by statute and law. The Attorney General serves as the legal counsel for state departments, agencies, boards, and other bodies, defends the state in court, serves as the chief law enforcement officer, brings actions on behalf of the state, and issues legal opinions that have the force of law until reversed by legislative or judicial actions. So the Attorney General's budget is just short of $130 million. 44% of it is general fund. And nearly half of the budget comes from charges for legal services to departments through IDG funding. And the same is with restricted. They also get direct payments from departments, but also receive some funding through restricted funds related to each department, so it's almost 50% coming in from other departments for its services to them. And its share of the total state general fund, like many of the departments that we're going to look like, is a nearly invisible slice of the pie. It's less than 1%. Looking at recent funding for the department, it for many years would receive kind of incremental increases owing to economics increases or the inclusion of some one-time funding that was replaced with other one-time funding in the following year. But in 2023, 24, and 25, significant increases due to both one-time appropriations and ongoing increases for the department. So in fiscal year 24, that included $20 million in one-time funding, and it also included increased authorization for 62 FTEs. And governor's recommendation for fiscal year 26 is a slight step up from fiscal year 25. So we look at the appropriation areas in the Attorney General. It brings us down to actually the line item level. So each of these areas is a separate line item in the budget. The bulk of the dollars are in the department operations. These are 3 bureaus and 24 divisions. It includes personnel and operational costs with executive administration, provision of legal services, and representation of the state departments. In the following lines, the next, excluding Prosecuting Attorneys Coordinated Council, or PAC, which is a Type 1 agency, independent, the following lines up until information technology, those are more programmatic lines relating to enforcement of child support. Public safety initiative is a assistance to prosecutors in certain high crime municipalities, and sexual assault law enforcement, which provides funds, has a memorandum of understanding between a number of communities for prosecutions and investigations of sexual assault, taking evidence from sexual assault kits. And then you have the standard IT line and one-time appropriations. There are no one-time appropriations recommended for fiscal year 26. And it removes, the governor's budget removes $1.9 million, which was appropriated in the current year. So I mentioned that the bulk of funding is in the operations line item. It is actually 92% of the department budget falls onto the operations line. Of this nearly $119 million, $46.2 million of it is general fund. And on the right side, all the smaller slices, those are all nearly 100% general fund, with some exceptions. So, as an example of some of the increases that was seen in the current fiscal year, there was an additional $3.5 million added in 16 FTE positions for that list of programs and legal services, including the Utility Consumer Representation Fund, the Cannabis Regulatory Agency, MyLeap, new agency, those are so increased services for them, criminal trials, and opioid recovery fund administration. For fiscal year 26, the governor recommends an additional $1.5 million in 8 FTEs. $900,000 would expand the price gouging unit and 3 FTEs, and then $600,000 for legal services to Michigan's federally recognized tribes. Oh, got a little behind myself here. I didn't realize I was falling so behind in my slides here. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. So we're on lawsuit settlements proceeds fund. I include a mention of it. These are from revenues and proceeds that the law gains from lawsuits that don't have a direct connection or court-ordered use. So they go into the lawsuit settlements proceeds fund, where they are designated as a restricted fund until the end of the fiscal year, in which case they lapse to the general fund. So they are effectively like general fund, but for that term, they are restricted. In the past several years, $2.7 million of it has been used for the investigation of the Flint water crisis. With the conclusion of that investigation, the executive budget recommends that amount, $2.7 million from the lawsuit settlements proceeds fund, be used for general purposes of the department. As you can see, though, the revenues are very highly unpredictable. They're based on cases, so it's not a steady stream. But $33.1 million is anticipated from ongoing cases in fiscal year 25. In addition to the Attorney General's services to the departments, it also has several initiatives that it is authorized to conduct. And I won't go into each of these initiatives here. I think I have about 10 listed. I think there's actually more listed on the Attorney General's website, but they include the Job Court, Elder Abuse Task Force, Organized Retail Crime, Conviction and Integrity Unit. For fiscal year 26, the governor is recommending an increase of $900,000 in private revenue for the organized retail crime. This money is actually from seizures that the unit has secured through prosecutions. Moving down the list, you have hate crimes unit, domestic terrorism, opioid litigation, PFAS contamination, payroll fraud enforcement unit, human trafficking, and robocall enforcement. And from boilerplate reporting, which splits out the costs, since these are all under the operations line item, the department submits a report showing what is spent for each of the listed initiatives, and they total about $9.4 million. $6.4 million of it is general fund, and also some restricted federal and IDGs funding. So overall, changes from the governor's budget to the current year, it is an increase of $2.6 million gross, $1.4 million general fund. This includes, these are a net increase, including the removal of $1.9 million one-time funding. And with the governor's budget, there's also a fiscal year 25 supplemental piece, and in that, $1 million is recommending to investigate the events surrounding the Oxford High School shooting. Moving on to civil rights. Civil rights was established in 1963 under the state constitution and charged it with investigating alleged discrimination against any person because of religion, race, color, or national origin. Throughout the years, statute has added to those protected classes, shown there. And the Department of Civil Rights acts as the administrative arm of the Civil Rights Commission, and charged with implementing its policies. Its primary work or focus is investigating civil rights complaints and resolving complaints through legal actions and mediation. It is made up mostly of general fund, 90% general fund, 10% of it is federal for housing and equal opportunity complaint cases. And Department of Civil Rights, it's the smallest executive department in the entire state budget. So again, it's hard to see there on the lower right corner of the pie. Like the Attorney General, the Civil Rights Department has seen more significant increases in the last few years over the last 10 or 15 years, starting in fiscal year 23. This, again, is from both one-time funding and ongoing increases for staffing, including 60 FTEs in, well, between fiscal year 23 and 25, there's an increase of 60 FTEs, specifically for complaint investigation. There was a backlog of complaint cases, so additional staffing and funding was provided to handle that backlog. You see the executive recommended amount over on the right side, and no one-time funding is recommended in 26. So again, the appropriation areas, it's a fairly small budget, so this is, again, down, these are individual line items in the budget, including complaint investigation and enforcement, the executive office. The governor is recommending 2 FTEs and $467,000 general fund for development, innovation, and access training, and this is to increase awareness of customer perspectives in work contexts. You have public affairs, which is involved with reaching out to locals or other private sectors for networking, partnership, presentations, training. There's a line item for museum support. This is $1.5 million, and it's split equally 3 ways to 3 museums: the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, and the Holocaust Memorial Center in Farmington Hills. And you have the standard IT line. The governor is recommending for IT an additional 2 FTEs and $767,000 general fund. This is partly to cover the hardware costs and increased services related to the increase of staffing over the last several years, but also to work on the Civil Rights Information System, that's their main IT system, and to develop a new complaints portal. And then there's the Division on Deaf, Deafblind, Hard of Hearing, which advocates on behalf of the deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing persons, and provides technical support, including translation services. So, funding for the department, nearly 2/3 of the department's funding goes towards complaint investigations and enforcement at $19.4 million. And next you see executive office, public affairs, and museum support. So the types of complaints that it gets, over half of all the civil rights complaints that the department handles is for employment-related reasons, at 57%, followed by public accommodation and services, and then housing, education, and law enforcement. This chart just shows for the complaint investigation and enforcement line specifically the increases that it's seen since fiscal year 22, along with the FTE increases. The governor is not recommending any additional resources for that in '26, except for an economics increase of about 3%. And this chart shows where authorized FTEs have been over the last several years and where actual filled FTE positions are. Back in fiscal year 21-22, they were actually under the authorized amount. And then with the increases due to the backlogs, those filled positions have steadily increased to match the authorized amount. So overall, for the governor's recommendation, it's a $1.6 million increase gross, which nearly all of that is general fund. So next is the smallest budget, but it's the executive office. The governor is the chief executive officer of the state, the commander-in-chief of the state's military establishment, and the chairperson of the state administrative board. The governor provides executive program and policy direction, submits an annual budget to the legislature, reviews and recommends statutory changes, appoints members to boards and commissions, and the entire budget is general fund. Looking back over recent years, there haven't been too many substantial changes in the budget. Nearly all these step-ups are economics increases, which the same holds true for the fiscal year 26 recommendation. I will say in fiscal year 23, there was an increase of 7 FTEs, which is not the typical economics increase. So within the executive office, you of course have the governor and the lieutenant governor, and then the executive office itself is comprised of about 86 personnel. It's authorized 86 FTEs. And then it also has 8 unclassified FTE positions. And there you see that most of it goes to the office and unclassified, and the only 2 smaller ones are for the salaries for the governor and lieutenant governor. So the day-to-day operations for the executive office include providing legal counsel to interpret legal matters, recommend appointments to judicial vacancies, boards, commissions, recommends policies, and manages external and legislative affairs. It acts as a liaison between the legislature, state departments, local state officials, and Washington, D.C., among other things. And again, the fiscal year 26 recommendation is a 3% economics increase, which equals $272,000 general fund, which is shown here. But moving on to legislature, which we're all very familiar with, so I won't spend too much time on that. Legislature is made up of 97% general fund. There are some restricted funds that make up 3% of the budget, or $5.4 million. This goes to the Capitol Historic Site Fund and court fees for the legislative retirement system. And you see that overall gross, it's 0% of the entire state budget, but if we're looking at just general fund, it's slightly larger at 1%. Lost some slides in my packet, so the executive recommendation for the legislature, similar to the executive office, is an operational increase of about 3%. So the legislature includes the House and the Senate, which we're familiar with, but it also includes the Legislative Council, and the legislative retirement system and property management and the state capital historic fund. And each of those executive recommended amounts are simply the economics increases that are recommended for each of those. So moving to the Auditor General, which is under the legislature budget, but it's split out separately since they are somewhat of an independent body. The Auditor General is a constitutional authority, and its mission is to improve accountability for public funds and operations of state government. And it conducts post-financial and performance audits of the state government, and it completes individual projects and reports in response to legislative requests. So audit reports provide information for legislative oversight of state government. It provides accountability, ensuring that receipts and expenditures are in accordance with all laws, and it assists state departments and agencies in improving their operations. About 2/3 of it is comprised of general fund. It's similar to the Attorney General in that it receives money from the executive departments for its services in the form of IDGs and state restricted funds. It's been a fairly steady incremental increases over the recent years, including in fiscal year 26. And so that increase for fiscal year 26 would be $937,000 gross. $642,000 of it would be general fund. So it has the types of audits that it performs fall under kind of three major categories. Well, one is financial audits, and these are the ones that ensure that all the accounting is done in compliance with general accepted accounting principles. It also performs the State of Michigan Comprehensive Annual Financial Report and the statewide single audit. It also does performance audits, which are the ones that look at specific programs under the departments. And it also does a combination of both performance and financial audits. About 52% of the audits that it does are financial, and the other 48% is performance. So looking at the output over the last years, it's been pretty steady with just slight variations year to year. It has 163 FTEs and produces around 60 reports a year. There you see the $937,000 increase for fiscal year 26 governor's budget. Moving on to the Department of State. Department implements policies of the state elected Secretary of State and administers programs in four major areas. These are motor vehicle transactions, which we're all personally familiar with, traffic safety, consumer protection, and election administration under the Board of Elections, or Bureau of Elections, sorry. Nearly all of the, driver vehicle side of the department is funded through restricted funds. There are multiple restricted funds, and then the remainder, the general fund portion of the budget generally goes to the elections administration. The 20 million IDGs is from the Motor Transport Fund that was set up decades ago to help support and make sure that there is enough funding for Department of State services. So again, it's a very small slice of the overall state budget pie at under 1%. Recent history, again, there's been some bump ups in fiscal year 23, 24, 25. This is related to election administration following Proposal 2 of 2022, relating to absentee ballots and many changes in the way that elections are administered. So that, because it included some one-time funding, that's why you see the step down in fiscal year 25, but overall, the ongoing funding has generally raised it up from fiscal year 22-23. And no significant increase recommended in fiscal year 26 by the governor. The appropriation areas include departmental administration and support. These are the department operations itself. Legal services, part of the Department of State's mission is to provide regulatory services for auto dealerships and vehicle repair centers. So legal services involved with that, along with other types of appeals that the department gets. Customer delivery services is the large section that covers all the Secretary of Branch offices as well as the central operations. Many of those transactions have gone online now, so that's also covered under customer delivery services. And you see election regulation and then IT. So over half of it goes to customer delivery services at about $155 million. Election administration is just 10% at $29 million. Despite being 10% of the overall budget, it is 68% of the department's general fund budget at $1.1 million, followed by IT, and then customer delivery services just gets a small amount at $1.1 million. This does not include, for election administration, it does not include general fund that is appropriated to the Treasury and then appropriated to the Department of State as restricted. That amounts to about $20 million total that's appropriated as restricted, but serves the same purpose of election administration. So under customer delivery services, you have the branch operations, which are the offices which I mentioned, Bureau of Driver and Vehicle Programs, Motorcycle Safety, the Organ Donor Program, and license plates. For fiscal year 26, the governor is recommending $640,000 restricted revenue to support 4 new positions for IT support. That's the department's CAR system. Let's see. So this is, again, looking at how the department is funded, except among the restricted, this shows how much the TAC fund comprises. TAC fund is a Transportation Administration Collection Fund, and it's the primary fund used for vehicle registration related administration expenses, and it makes up 57% of the entire state budget. So it's an important fund for the department. And it's funded through various fees. In increasing expenses going back to before 2020 and steady revenue were leading to a revenue shortfall for the TAC fund and for the department. The chart shows it better here. So a lot going on, but each year has a green and a blue. If you look at the green, which is the revenue that it takes in, compared to the blue expenses, you can see that the expenses were starting to exceed the amount that it took in year to year. And though it had an amount carrying forward each year in the fund, that carry forward amount was diminishing, so it was clear that there was going to be a revenue shortfall. To help that situation, there were some one-time increases that were taken from the transportation fund to augment that, and then money was appropriated to Treasury and put into the TAC fund to help support it. But that was kind of a temporary solution. So starting in fiscal year 23, a fee increase of $4 was approved for bulk record sales. With that $4 increase, that has given $20 million in additional revenue a year to the TAC fund. So fiscal year 24 was the first full fiscal year with that new revenue, and you can see that the revenue in the green there exceeds expenditures, and the light green is what the carry forward is from year to year. So it is now in a stable position and with about $70 million carrying forward from year to year. Under election and regulation, so the Bureau of Elections provides guidance to locals for election administration. It provides for the qualified voter file, which is the state's central voter registration database and system, and it also provides for county clerk training. Going back several years now, the federal government has provided grants in the form stemming from the Help America Vote Act, which goes back to the Bush-Gore election. However, it's been used more recently to administer election security grants. And these are about $5 to $10 million. The supplemental piece of the governor's budget is recommending $9.6 million from Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, dollars. That 9.6 is made up of several pieces. 7.6 million of it is a reappropriation of a lapsed work project. So these were appropriated back in 2020, I believe. Work projects are valid for 4 years. So this is reappropriating that lapsed work project. Then there's an additional $1 million that was provided under the federal budget in 2024, and then $1 million appropriated for the interest accrued on the federal HAVA funds that we've had set aside. This is for fiscal year 25 recommendation. So under the election administration, we also have the Office of the Great Seal. And that's manages notary publics and keeps the state's official Great Seal and affixes to all official documents, among other services. So here we see the overall difference for the governor's budget. It's an increase of $4.7 million gross. Nearly all of it is restricted funding. Moving on to DTMB. DTMB, as it exists today, was created through a merger in fiscal year 2011 that brought into the Department of Management and Budget with the Department of Information Technology. And it's the centralized service provider for all executive branch departments. So it's one of its biggest responsibilities is information technology services. It also manages and maintains state properties, facilities, the entire motor vehicle fleet for the state. It develops the executive budget recommendation and monitoring the budget. It does state accounting functions for the departments, and it manages the retirement systems for school employees, judges, state police, and the military. So DTMB budget is about $1.8 billion of it. 63% of it is in the form of IDGs at $1.1 billion. And of that IDG number, about $1 billion of it is specifically for IT. And then you have other amounts for the motor vehicle fleet and for building facilities maintenance. 30% is general fund at about $539 million, followed by smaller amounts of restricted and barely any federal or private. So between this slide and the next, you see the DTMB operations is about 1% of the state budget, but if you look at general fund, it jumps up to about 4% of the entire state budget. Looking back over recent years, similar to other departments, we see jumps up in fiscal year 23, 24, followed by a step down in 25. In fiscal year 24, you see a lot of general fund in the dark blue. This was from primarily nearly all one-time funding. This included funding for ITIF, which we'll cover in a slide coming up. That's the Information Technology Investment Fund. But also about $286 million for the Make It in Michigan Competitiveness Fund, which we will also look at, and facility maintenance, $25 million for maintenance of state facilities. And with 25, takes a step down, and fiscal year 26 is similar, but it recommends some one-time funding that makes that step up a little bit larger than past years, and we'll look at that one, those requests. The appropriation areas, the top departmental administration and support. This is the budget side of the Department of Budget and Technology Management and Budget. Covers budget and financial management, building operations, motor vehicle fleet, and other operations. The next is the technology side of the department, technology services. This is where the IDG funding goes, but also other program areas covered by a general fund. There's a unit for special programs that includes various programs, but it also includes the Office of Retirement Services and the Office of the Child Advocate, formerly the Office of the Children's Ombudsman. SBA rent, which is that $246 million general fund for bond debt. The Civil Service Commission is an independent Type 1 agency that has been included under the DTM budget, and it is responsible for the classification and compensation rates of Michigan civil service employees. There's a capital outlay section. This is specifically for maintenance and renovation of state facilities. And then you have the department's own IT appropriation for its own IT needs, and then one-time appropriations. Here is those sections from the last slide broken into slices. Technology services, again, the largest at 57%, followed by departmental administration and support. For general fund, by far SBA rent is the largest, and then followed by technology services. And even though nearly all of it's supported by IDGs, there's still $141 million general fund for IT programs and systems. So DTMB has kind of a wide collection of various services and offices, and I won't go into each of these, but just to give you an idea of what's included under DTMB, you have its department's administrative services, which include billings, contracts, leases, the budget and financial management, which includes the state budget office, the Office of Financial Management, which does a lot of the accounting services. And you have building operation services, operate and maintain the state buildings, equipment and grounds, business support services, they deal with real estate services, and design and construction. This is for project planning, architectural and engineering services. And then you can see the executive recommendation for each of those. $771,000 for 11 FTEs for the state budget office specifically. $3.8 million in IDG funding to reflect an increase of building occupancy rate that are charged to departments. And a small $272,000 for staffing at the State Record Center. Going on, you have the Michigan Center for Data and Analytics. This provides statistics on labor markets and other things. You have the motor vehicle services. This covers the state motor vehicle fleet, Office of the State Employer, Property Management, State Archives, which was added in the current fiscal year. It moved over from the DNR. And then there's $1 million for the state fleet electric vehicle transition. This is money specifically for the planning and the preparation of transitioning the state's vehicle fleet to electric vehicles and to analyze those needs. There is $5.4 million in IDG funding recommended by the governor for fiscal year 26 for a motor vehicle fleet, and this is to align authorization with anticipated revenue from an increase in rates to departments. Moving on to IT. As mentioned, it is recently in the last maybe 5 years, there's been a movement to entirely centralize IT services under DTMB, and it's funded entirely with IDG revenue. And each department requests spending authority to fund IT in its department, and then it comes to through IDGs to DTMB. As of February of this year, DTMB manages 261 active IT projects, but that does not include just the maintenance of existing service that are not necessarily defined as IT projects. In fiscal year 26, every year there is an IDG adjustment to align with what's appropriated to the departments. That adjustment is $19.2 million for fiscal year 26, and it includes, part of that includes an investment to the Civil Service Commission, which I will cover in a slide a little bit further below. This chart shows IT spending statewide in the light green, and then DTMB's portion for its department in blue. It had, after COVID, kind of stepped down a little bit, and then fiscal year 24 coming back up to where it was in 18 and 19. So I previously mentioned the Information Technology Investment Fund, or ITIF. This is a pool of general fund appropriated each year to for certain projects that have been selected as offering the best return for the state. So it's what DTMB has identified as priority systems, legacy systems to modernize. And it's funded through a combination of ongoing and one-time funding in recent years. The ongoing funding has kind of leveled out to be $35 million, and sometimes there are large one-time appropriations, sometimes smaller ones. As we saw earlier, there's a very large one in fiscal year 24, or in 23, sorry. And each year it recommends between 5 to 10 new projects, and there are about 20 active projects any given year. There's a history of general fund that's been appropriated for ITIF. At first, much of it went to Sigma, which is the state's big accounting system. It was the state's largest IT project ever. After that went away, it made room for other projects. In fiscal year 23, there is a very large appropriation to appropriate about $75 million to replace the unemployment insurance IT system known as MIDAS. In fiscal year 26, you'll see the governor the recommendation is the second largest ever, and it includes 5 or 6 projects. One of those projects is an additional $20 million for the MIDAS, for replanning of that system. And it's not clear if that will complete the system replacement or not. The 26 appropriation also includes a recommendation of about $23 million for replacement of the Civil Service Commission's Human Resource Management Network, or HRMN. It's $23.5 million in ITIF that will cover the 3 to 4 year period to cover the project. And there is a corresponding increase under Civil Service Commission to cover half of those project costs. It's appropriated as ongoing funding, but it's a limited term ongoing funding to cover the period of that project. And that increase to Civil Service Commission is about $7.5 million. I can send a list to all of you with the fiscal year 26 recommended ITIF projects. I don't think I'm going to go into much detail with the programs under the Special Programs Appropriation Unit. I'll note that the Capital City Services was a new program added in fiscal year 24, and this is a grant to the City of Lansing to maintain or improve local roads, sidewalks, public utility infrastructure, emergency response, traffic management, etc. It also includes the Office of Retirement Services there. So the Civil Service Commission is an independent agency. Its funding is guaranteed by the state constitution to receive a sum not less than 1% of the aggregate payroll of the classified service for the preceding fiscal year. Its responsibilities include classification of civil service positions according to duties and responsibilities, administration of employee benefits, providing human resource services, and setting rules and regulations covering personnel transactions. As I mentioned before, there's the $7.5 million appropriated as limited term ongoing, which is not a real category, but it's ongoing for the life of the project to cover the replacement of the Herman system. And then a separate $1.3 million gross increase of $628,000 general fund for 9 FTEs for human resource services to the state for hiring and staffing operations statewide. So State Building Authority rent, this is that large pool of general fund to pay down bond debt. It is recommended by the governor in fiscal year 26 an additional $15.5 million general fund, and this is simply to adjust for the number of capital outlay projects that are existing and to cover the state's obligated to debt towards that. Next, I mentioned in fiscal year 24 a large $286 million appropriation for the Make It in Michigan Competitiveness Fund. So looking at that, that was created to leverage various federal funding opportunities from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IJA, or EJA, also known as there's another name for it. Sorry, I forget. The Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. And an interagency evaluation committee has been formed to make recommendations for projects for the state to support to provide basically state match funding to leverage federal funding opportunities. There was $50 million appropriated general fund, followed by a $286.8 million general fund appropriation, which was actually deposited into the fund. Together, that's $337 million general fund for the Make It in Michigan Competitiveness Fund program. As of January, there's a available balance of $128 million. So about $202 million has been dedicated to projects. In January, President Trump signed an executive order pausing disbursements of federal funding, and it specified funding under IJA and the IRA, possibly in the CHIPS Act too. And it targets funding specifically. It's broader now, but it's originally really targeted funding for the electric vehicle mandate, which many of the projects under the Make It in Michigan Competitiveness Fund are aimed towards. So the status of the funding for some of these programs is questionable. This slide is a list of the projects. It's not exhaustive. You'll see at the bottom there's 7 smaller projects not listed, but a list of the larger projects that have been approved funding. The state fund portion and then the federal fund portion that's been drawn down. The numbers with asterisks are the ones that have actually received the funds. Those without had not yet received the federal funds. So it's not clear on whether those will be coming or not. But many of these are for battery technology, clean energy, so this pie chart shows how much of the state dollars has gone towards projects seeking funds under these federal acts. So most of it is 40% is under IJA, and then 21 million or 6% under the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's about just over a third of the fund remains available. So other one-time appropriations recommended for DTMB include $25 million for state maintenance. This would fall under the capital outlay appropriation area. Includes maintenance, demolition, and infrastructure projects for the state's buildings. So together, the one-time piece, together with the ongoing piece, would total about $53 million, as recommended by the governor for fiscal year 26. The governor also recommends $10 million to create a self-sustaining fund to self-insure property and building contents at state-owned facilities. Premiums for property insurance have been increasing significantly due to disasters nationwide. So to help mitigate against those premium increases, they are seeking to create a self-funding mechanism for the state to counter that. Next one is $5 million for financing of projects at state facilities for energy efficiency, renewable energy. This is not a new program. There was $5 million recommended several years ago. This will be the second deposit into this program, where the idea would be that new projects, money earned from renewable energy, cost efficiency projects, savings would go back into the fund to continue funding new energy efficient projects. So in this table, I've removed that technical transfer of restricted dollars in the current year. So you'll see that the governor's recommendation comes at $119 million increase over last year and a $74 million general fund increase from fiscal year 25. And moving on to our last department, Treasury. Treasury acts as the chief fiscal agency for the executive branch of the state and the primary source of advice to the governor on tax and fiscal policy issues. It collects state taxes, it invests the state funds, disperses state monies. It's the primary grant administrator for the state, and protects the state credit rating and the credit rating for cities, among many other things. 87% of the Treasury budget goes to revenue sharing. No, I'm sorry. 87% is state restricted. 1.8 billion of that is for revenue sharing. So 11% is general fund. You see that among the whole state budget, 3% is Treasury, and that includes debt service and revenue sharing. And that's the general fund portion. I'll keep moving. Looking back, fiscal year 23 stands out. It received a huge spike of general fund, and this was specifically for $850 million for local pension grants to help local municipalities pay off pension liabilities left over. And I will mention, when I talked about the entire general government funding history, several of those increases were from LEO, which is no longer in general government. So some of those huge general fund appropriations for SOAR were a LEO appropriation, and that's been removed back in fiscal year 23 or 4. I can't remember when it left. So for the tax and financial and tax programs under Treasury, the governor is recommending $3.8 million gross, $363,000 general fund to transfer those. It won't increase any amount, but it would create a new Bureau of Operational Excellence within Treasury. This is kind of a lean process improvement type office. So it just consolidates similar functions and other line items into one line item to do those services in a centralized office. Other appropriations under Treasury include debt service, grants, the Gaming Control Board, and lottery. Both are two separate independent agencies that are included in the Treasury Department. You have payments in lieu of taxes. These are funds that the state pays to local units to cover the loss of taxable land due to the state ownership of that land. So it offsets the losses to the locals. And then revenue sharing and a few other programs. So there you see the percentage of revenue sharing for the entire Treasury budget at 2/3 of it. General fund is largely, apart from debt service, is mostly concentrated under local government programs and to grants. Just gonna jump in. Quickly mention the Bureau of State Lottery. It is funded entirely from the revenue from lottery sales, ticket sales, or other kind of electronic gaming. And the governor is recommending a $4.9 million increase in that state restricted funding for sales and to support sales and promotions of lottery products. You see the revenue that the Bureau has taken in. Fiscal year 23, which was the latest data at the time I put this together, was the second highest in ever. Here's some more detail on payments in lieu of taxes, or PILT, which I won't get into, but the governor recommends an additional $3.2 million gross to adjust payments with current property tax estimates. And nearly last is revenue sharing. In fiscal year 25, there was a change in the way that payments were dispersed. It included a kind of a continuation of revenue sharing payments. And I'm sorry, I should say this is legislative. There's constitutional revenue sharing, and this is based at on a per capita formula, and it's 15% of sales tax collections at a 4% rate. And the governor is recommending, it's really just more of a technical calculation based on sales tax revenue, but that comes to an increase of $25.7 million increase. But for statutory revenue sharing, there was a change in the way that some of that funding was administered. There's an additional amount of approximately $30 million for CBTs, based on a formula of 3 factors that was based off of statute going back to around the time that revenue sharing was created. Those 3 factors include split 3 ways evenly based on inverse taxable value per capita, the population, and then the yield equalization, or the amount that the revenues are able to secure through millages. The governor recommends a continuation of this new distribution for fiscal year 26. It also recommends a 4% increase to an amount of kind of, I guess, traditional or customary CBTs, but keeps the 3 funding formula for the remaining units. County revenue sharing is a bit similar to CVT, except instead of a 3-factor, it's more of a 1-factor increase or formula. And the governor is recommending a similar 4% increase to the base, which equals $10.4 million total. There was also in fiscal year 25 the introduction of the Public Safety and Violence Prevention Fund. It's totaled $75 million, also from sales tax revenue. And it's payments to CVTs and, under certain conditions, counties that provide police services, and it's dispersed based on crime rates and capital expenditures for public safety and violence prevention services. The governor is recommending a continuation of this in fiscal year 26. There's also a supplemental piece in fiscal year 25 that adds boilerplate language that would stand in place of 2 bills that were not enacted in the last session. So in the absence of those bills, boilerplate must be inserted for those payments to be dispersed. And finally, these are the one-time appropriations recommended for Treasury. You have $25 million recommended for the removal of hazardous arc wiring in Detroit. It's from a wiring system for street lights that is no longer in use and can be dangerous when coming in contact into existing or actual working wiring. $5 million for 4 FTEs to promote for promotion of the MyAble program, which permits creates a separate account for people to secure federal funds. $2.5 million and 17 FTEs to administer the proposed new tax by the governor on for vaping and non-tobacco nicotine products. This is just the administration portion of that proposed tax, which is estimated to bring in about $50 to $60 million on those products. $9.2 million increase is recommended for the Marijuana Regulation Fund for grants to locals. $1.1 million for AI, to use AI for the Treasury's multiple databases to help detect fraud and for finding efficiencies. $892,000 for the Bureau of Financial and Accounting Services to implement a payment card industry data compliance standards, fraud monitoring, and expansion of the optional income tax program. And $3 million in private funding donated by the Ballmer Group to create the Michigan Financial Empowerment Program aimed at providing financial literacy and education services to residents. There you see $86 million increase in the governor's budget compared to last year. Much of that is restricted funding for revenue sharing. $14.2 million general fund increase. And that is the surface of general government. I am available for questions now, but again, if there's any questions about the presentation, please feel free to reach out.
Any questions? Rep. Kelly?
Thank you. Back in the Department of Attorney General's budget, under Department Initiatives and Programs, I don't see where her program to go after oil and gas.
That might be labeled, if it's not there, it might be labeled as utility rate increases.
Interesting way to put it. That's where they're putting. She seems to have made a concerted effort about going out and soliciting firms to sue. Seems to me that it should be a separate program, but anyway.
Yeah, if it's included in the table in the following slide, utility rate increases. I
Okay.
remiss to not include that in the description list. But the table shows that it spends about $2.2 million in fiscal year 24
Okay.
for that. 1.9 million of that is restricted funding.
All right. And additionally, you mentioned work projects are good for 4 years.
They can be good up to 4 years. They can be specified to be active for a shorter period, but most of them are 4 years.
Is that in statute or promulgated?
So there are work projects that are approved and actually initiated by the legislature in boilerplate, but then there's also work projects that are approved through the administrative process.
I mean the length of time, this 4-year
Yeah,
thing.
Yes, I would say by statute they are 4 years. When they are authorized, some of them will say the time length that they plan to spend the money for, but I think by default they are valid for 4 years.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Vice Chair Bender?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to the other side of the presentation on the debt service that we do 95.1 million. Is that all the debt service? Is that even is that the state roads, or what was that all encompassing?
that
what
is-
was the trajectory on that?
There are three specific debts, I guess, that is paying down, and it's what's called general obligation debts, and those are debts from bonds that have been approved through by voters, I guess, through the state, through
Oh, okay.
state referendum. So I can get more detail. Let's see. Quality of Life Bond, Environmental Protection, Clean Michigan Initiative, and Great Lakes Water Quality Bond are the three specific debts.
That are under that
Yeah.
portion. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Van Workum. Rep. Maddock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Over the past 4 years, we've noticed a significant increase in level 15 employees in all of these departments. Close to a 40% increase in wage. Has the department done an analysis of why this has happened over the past 4 years?
The department being DTMB or
All of the departments
so.
in general government have received, level 15 employees have received a pay scale increase like this, while other employees have gotten a pay scale increase like this. Why are these level 15 employees that work for these, that run the departments, getting such a massive pay increase over the past 4 years?
I see. Yeah, I didn't hear the level 15 part. I'm not familiar with the increase in that, but we can ask some questions and figure out, because economics increases are included for all
No, these
civil
start-
service,
these-
but for that specific classification, I'm not sure.
These wage increases for the level 15 employees have far outweighed the economic increases that everyone else has got. I'd like you to look into that, please, and provide us with a list of all these department heads that have gotten these massive salary increases, and if there's been an analysis done of why they've been singled out themselves to get these big pay increases. Thank you.
I'll ask the Civil Service Commission.
Anything more, Rep. Maddock? Okay, Rep. Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On slide 96, under the DTMB, you talk about the 25 million for one-time maintenance and demolition for infrastructure projects for state-owned buildings and structures. Have we gotten any more information from the department about what actually this is for? It's laid out as special maintenance projects, I guess, and I would like to identify what special maintenance projects are.
It's-
Why are these more special than any other maintenance projects?
They're not very special. They should have a list available, or at least a list of prior projects that are funded. So there is an ongoing piece of $28 million. So this is to, I guess, include more projects like those. But generally speaking, they are parking lot improvement, roofing, HVAC systems, and I think there has been requests improved in prior years for additional one-time funding, I think, to just kind of keep up with the needs. So every so years they request an additional one-time amount. I think back in there's been like a request for like $100 million in recent years, additional for projects. But if I can get you a list of projects that have been covered and possibly what will be covered under the 26 recommendation.
Sure, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Rep. Maddock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the civil rights department, could you tell us how many complaints they receive a year, and how many of those complaints are actually litigated in a year? In other words, if they receive 3,000 complaints over the past, I'd like to go back over I've seen a massive increase in employees in this department, and I'm trying to justify it in my mind. If we've gone from 100 complaints to 10,000 complaints, maybe that's justification, but my real question is, how many of these complaints are legitimate complaints that are actually litigated by the department? Not just people calling in making complaints, actual, genuine violations of the law where litigation is initiated. I like these numbers over the past 3 years because we've seen the department go from 40 employees to 126 employees, and I just can't believe those numbers.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on it last year. I have data going up to fiscal year 23. That includes complaints initiated, closed, open pending. It looks like in fiscal year 23, just over 2,000 were initiated. But I can send you this report and also get an update on where those numbers are currently.
Thank you. Would appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? I have a couple and a couple comments. I know Rep. Kelly asked about oil and gas funds. It seems to me, if looking through the boilerplate, AG is required to give us a report on outside legal, but has not given us any report since 2023. Is there anything we can do about that?
Do you know which report that is? I'm trying to think
Well,
which one.
I don't have it right here in front of me, but I will get it for you. But in the report section, they say, well, look at our website. And the website only has reports going up to 2023 and has no reports after that. And so I was just a little concerned about how much the AG is paying for outside counsel, which would include some oil and gas as well as the, Enbridge and other projects that the AG has expended outside funds for. And with regard to the 4-year time frame for projects, work projects, could you see if you can find the actual statutory reference for that?
Yes.
I'm not right now, but just so that we have it and we can look at the actual language. I had a couple questions. On page 16, you talk about operations in the AG department, including 92%, but I think we've had discussions that none of this is giving us any detail. What can we do to get more detail from the AG on what they are spending for operations?
So, the one report, on the initiatives, that broke out costs by certain initiatives. That's required in boilerplate, but that's only about $10 million of that total line item. You could request spending by division, by bureau, other ways that transparency is sometimes pursued is by breaking out a line item according to those program areas, or it can be done in various ways, but that would, I guess, more easily allow you to see in the accounting system how much has been spent for each program area and how much, when it's appropriated, how much goes to each area. Otherwise, it can be done through boilerplate reporting.
Okay, and how much success do we have from the AG actually providing reports?
Yeah, I mean, I don't always get the reports on time. That's one department that I don't think it updates its online reports regularly.
Okay. All right, and on page 18, it talks about opioid recovery, and I know when we talked about that last year in this committee, the issue is the AG just takes this money and sends it to the locals without requiring any reporting. Is that something we can require through boilerplate?
I'm sorry, was that for their opioid
Yeah, the
case?
opioid recovery funds that the AG sends to all these local governments. Could we require by boilerplate that there be some report as to how the local governments are using these massive amounts of funds?
I think in current year, the AG has established a website that kind of tracks disbursements. I don't think it tracks expenditures. But because those funds become the locals, it can be difficult to require the department to report on details of local spending. So that level of detail may be difficult. We can look into what's possible. But as far as details for, who gets how much by what settlement, lawsuit settlement, that has been put on a website. And there's boilerplate requiring that website be maintained.
Okay, great. On page 19, it's lawsuit proceeds, and projected for this year, it goes up to 33.1 million, much higher than we've seen in recent years. Do we have any idea what those proceeds are from? Or can we get that information?
Yes, we can. There's a report that shows by case anticipated revenue. I want to say, I'm not certain, I think it's from a lawsuit against Google, where the bulk of that increase.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Knassen. Any other questions from any committee members? Okay, well, thank you all very much. And next week we'll be talking about boilerplate again. At Vice Chair Van Workum's suggestion, we're going to look at the boilerplate from the House-passed budget in 2022 to get a little historical context, but please think about boilerplate. This is how we assure oversight and accountability and guardrails on these departments. So thanks again. The meeting is adjourned.